Hello and welcome to the Ask Me Anything sessions. I'm René Michau and we are here coming to you live from the Rapyd office at the Working Capital building in Singapore. For those of you in the virtual map, hopefully you found us via visiting Boat Quay in the networking zone. What we'd like to do today is have a nice relaxed conversation, and we're going to work through a series of questions, Ask Me Anything. We're really looking for quite a lot of audience participation. So if we can, as you log in, open up the chat box and feel free to drop any questions in there. I'll be checking my phone just to make sure I'm keeping track of those. So looking forward to lots of interesting questions. Okay, now I'd like to introduce our speakers. We have, can I just get that flashed up on the screen, please? Thank you. Great. I'd like to introduce Todd Schweitzer from Brankas and Mike Dickinson, also from Brankas. We're going to spend a lot of time together getting to know these two wonderful gentlemen, and I feel very privileged to be able to speak to them today. So, gents, Todd, I'm going to start with you. For our audience, can you do me a huge favour? I mean, we've managed to overcome all sorts of technical hurdles, plug lots of cables in and make everything work. Tell us a bit about how you got here today, what you do at Brankas, and a bit about that story.
Sure. Thanks, René, and thanks also to the Rapyd team for organizing this AMA. So my name is Todd Schweitzer. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Brankas. I'm based in the Philippines, but we're a distributed team operating across Southeast Asia. And we are, we like to think that we're building the very beginnings of open banking, open finance infrastructure for Southeast Asian markets, for Southeast Asian consumers, startups, and even for financial institutions. So we work really on both sides of the API economy for the financial institutions and financial service providers that are exposing products as APIs. And we can probably get into some of those use cases and demand. And then we also work on the demand side as an API aggregator for online businesses or even traditional corporates that are looking for a more online and more modern way to connect to financial services. What I think is so interesting about open banking and open finance in Southeast Asia is, unlike Europe or Australia's consumer data right, for example, this is a pretty unregulated space, right? And so we're talking about initiatives that are really commercially driven. It's very much bottom-up, market-driven, based on demand from consumers, from fintechs, from corporate clients of these FIs that are looking to that are looking for modern solutions. I should also caveat that when I talk about Southeast Asia, I am not really talking about Singapore. In Singapore, a lot of financial services work just fine, and there's some great innovation. And I think this week's particularly timely with the Singapore Fintechs being announced on Monday that allows, that it basically be the AISP or account data aggregation model available to Singaporeans and residents of Singapore, which is awesome. But really, when we think about Southeast Asia, we're talking about the big, complicated, emerging markets of Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia to some degree, Myanmar to some degree, even sort of some adjacent markets like Bangladesh and India. So happy to, looking forward to the discussion.
Todd, thank you so much. And Mike, fill us in. What's your role with Brankas, and what's exciting you about this really specific and certainly not uncomplicated problem that you guys are working to solve?
Yeah, thanks, René. So I'm the Chief Product Officer at Brankas, and I mean, I guess what's very interesting to me, just as Todd was pointing out before, like it's a very new space. It's and on top of that, it's to be honest with you, the whole open banking movement that's happened in the likes of Australia, in Europe, is actually well needed in Southeast Asia, minus Singapore. And there's I'll put it this way. There are fintech companies that approach us all the time, and they're asking, like, I have a problem. That problem is connecting to a bank, right? And how do I do that? And we go, well, there's a reason why you're not the only person saying that, because it's actually difficult. built, right?
Yeah.
And so this is something which, like if we are able to build this infrastructure, if we are able to open up these services and help FIs to do this and provide to not just fintechs, like any business, financial services and financial processes and improve them, right? We will build a better economy, generally speaking, right?
Yeah.
So that's what excites me.
That's awesome. So, guys, I guess I know you've spent a lot of time talking about the product, and Todd, I saw your session yesterday. It was really engaging around that level of complexity, the way that problem is being solved, but also the importance of that. I'm going to ask you to reflect both personally and professionally. What do you think's been the number one lesson of 2020 for you guys?
So I will give two lessons. One is internal to the organization and one is external. Internal to the organization is an obvious one, but I have to repeat it. Like, remote first is the way forward for a technology company, and especially in Southeast Asia. I feel very, very fortunate because this obviously was not a deliberate, yes, we planned to be remote from the start, but obviously we weren't realizing how beneficial it would be for a situation. We certainly were not planning for pandemic proofing our organization, right? But the fact that Brankas has been a distributed team from the start means that, so in Manila, for example, on like March 13th or 14th, hard lockdown, China style, do not leave your condo building for like 2 months, right?
Yep.
And we had zero operational disruption because this was, it had no impact on office environment. We've worked operationally. This is how we do it, right? And so our lesson was like, this is just it's so valuable to have the flexibility of teams in multiple markets being able to draw from a talent pool across countries and across time zones. I think is so beneficial. And again, it's become almost cliche to talk about the value of remote working, but like, for a proper engineering company, and especially in Southeast Asia, where senior engineering talent is hard to find in one particular city, right? It's been a real asset. Externally, our lesson has been that banks are again, emerging in emerging Asia, right? Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, even Thailand to some degree. I think the banks are realizing that they need to let go of the branch-centric model, particularly for consumer and SME, right? This is obvious to some people, but I think for more traditional incumbent banks in emerging markets, the old game is just build branches, and that's your distribution model. Build branches, make sure that your relationship managers and branch managers have certain incentives to drive business into that branch. Have all the organizational KPIs aligned towards the relationship manager, right? Focus on paper documentation and brick and mortar and personal physical relationships between the bank's representatives and the clients, right? And the pandemic was a forcing function for banks, again, especially on the consumer and SME segments, to break that model, because it literally was not an option for several months, right? And those banks that had digital channels were able to accelerate growth, and those banks that did not, growth came to a halt, right?
Yep. No, that's awesome. I think that there's so much that we can pick up on, and you're right about, a lot of banks in the region have really large enormous branch networks over huge geographic areas. A really big, fixed cost that's been part of the business for a very long time and a critical part of outreach. I will drill into that a bit later on, but Mike, I wanted to ask you, Todd spoke very much about the talent aspect of being a distributed firm. When you look at product evolution, a lot of the challenge can be with developing a product, really tapping into local knowledge, that kind of sense of that street smarts, that sense of the local environment. Has that sort of influenced the distributed nature of your network? Has that influenced the way that you build product and the way that you test product?
Yes, it has. That's a great question. Yes, it has. So I'll start at one level first, which is the sort of the team structure and how you have to implement it. And we had plans at the beginning of the year. Obviously, those were thrown to the wayside. And so what it meant was that we we need to start really thinking about how to structure the product organization, based on, the markets that we were in, but not necessarily saying, okay, product managers, which were like looking after a particular product, are in this particular country, right? It's more like get an idea for how different customers are interacting with your product, and obviously for different countries that's going to be different, right? And we also have a sort of new function where we're performing a lot more research initiatives from a user experience perspective, and that has to be very tied to the user, right? And so the product managers will then rely on the research function in order to facilitate insights, because one of our product managers, for example, he's based in the Philippines, right? But he's also got his same product, solving for slightly different problems in Indonesia. He needs people in Indonesia to provide him feedback, which are, coming from different perspectives, right? So that's number one, that's internal, and from both the sales organization as well as also within product themselves. But then there's also the external factor, which is like, it's funny, right? Because like now we don't actually have to go to the office, and now we don't have to go and speak to people in the B2B landscape. People tend to be a little bit more open to just jumping on a call and saying, hey, I'll provide feedback, I'll help you out. Whereas in my previous experience, it's like, if you had to organize a meeting and to rock up, right, that was a huge investment in time and from a lot of people's perspectives, especially if you're talking to founders of startups in other organizations. They see it as stop wasting my time type of thing. It's a bit different now.
That's look, I think that's quite a powerful insight. In terms of your personal experience of the year, what's your big lesson from 2020?
Big lesson from 2020 is to keep pushing forward. That's the most important thing. It's funny, I talk to lots of founders for example, in the sort of travel and tourism space, and of course, this, right? And for them, my advice to them is to pivot, figure out ways to to get through this, right? Of course, they're looking for funding. Of course, they're trying to find other products which can help with the personas they're after. So that's from that side. But from our side, I mean, we've been, I was talking to Todd about this a couple of months back. But I asked the question, do you think the pandemic's actually helped us? And he says, undoubtedly, yes. Yes, the answer to that is yes. And part of the reason for that is that it's pushing, the philosophy of how technology can help financial services. So that goes back to my original point. The lesson learned is keep pushing hard, and great things will come, and they are at Brankas for sure.
No, that's awesome. Thank you for that. I want to come back to, for a moment, if we can, to the distribution approach for traditional organisations in Southeast Asia. And it's not just true for banks, it's also true for insurance, for a lot of other industries where that in-person, paper-based distribution model, often through agents or, this really distributed piece, right? You've got a challenge where you're working across, a number of archipelago in many instances, and even those countries like Vietnam and Cambodia, which are not. There's a lot of similar logistics complexity in the market for those distribution models. So I want to ask you, I guess, two questions, and I'm happy for either of you to dive in and answer, right? So the first question is, how is the work you're doing affected by the geographic challenges, if at all? And also, what are companies looking to you for in terms of trying to solve those challenges and reshape the distribution models in a sort of post-pandemic world?
Yeah, let me give just a quick comment, and then Mike can go a bit deeper. It's more of a meta comment, but it covers this, which is banks. So we operate under a premise that, in the Philippines, for example, where I live, banking penetration is only 40%, or in some cases under 40%, depending on what you're looking at, right? The reason is because the traditional banks deliberately are choosing not to bank a certain customer segment because they say that segment is unprofitable, right? And there are examples of this, right? So, for example, the Central Bank of the Philippines mandates a certain portion of every bank's loan book to be allocated towards agricultural loans. Most of the large banks just pay the fine to the central bank. Wow. Because they just opt out, right? They say no, thank you, right? And this has been a common thing for years. So they just treat it as a cost of compliance, right? Rather than actually solving agricultural lending problems, right? So that's a market inefficiency that needs to be addressed. Having an open banking ecosystem with products like account opening, identity, statement and account data, and payments means the banks don't need to solve the problem, but they can provide APIs to fintechs who can then go super down into a specific customer segment or a specific geography or a specific type of problem or a specific type of credit need that is not addressed by the bank today, because the bank doesn't have the resources, or frankly, they might not have the eagerness because it's a small size of their overall, of their overall income, right? So they say,
Yep.
nah, not worth it. But if it's going to be zero cost for us to give API access to a third party fintech to solve this very niche problem for us, and we get some sort of transaction fee or kind of risk, lower risk fee income or interest income coming back to us, then great, fantastic. And then we don't have to set up a new branch in some far-flung location, right? And deal with all of the physical logistics and all that. So I think that the question of geography, like, yes, Indonesia and Philippines, these are archipelagos, logistics is complicated. And yeah, for sure, if you're running a branch network and you have to have cash trucks and you have to get people out there and you have to do checks and audits on the branches, for sure it's complicated. But if your distribution model is based on partnering with fintechs through open finance, all of a sudden those problems that you think made serving an archipelago complicated go away, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, so Mike, I don't know if your thoughts on this, sort of thinking about the kind of complications of distribution and how open banking addresses that.
Yeah, I'll try and hit two birds with one stone with a use case, right? So in Indonesia, so right now, banks, you can, like, for certain banks, you can create a bank account online. What that requires you is to go through the mobile application, enter your credentials, and then you get on a video call with somebody on customer service on the bank side. Now, if you do that at 2 a.m., you've got some sleepy people on the other side, right? But like that's the process. That's the process. Now, of course, with the pandemic, this use case I'm referring to is actually a very new one to us, whereby people, of course, are not able to go or are rarely able to go to a branch outlet, right? And to be able to set up a bank account. And so, how do you do it? Well, it's either you get the mobile application for the bank that you're able to do the sort of digital KYC, as well as also onboarding and creating a bank account, which can be that there's only a select few, or you're pretty much stuck, right? So what we found is that when we started talking to different institutions, their educational institutions, large corporates, right? So one thing that they have to do is set up payroll accounts, for example, in Indonesia, right? And how do they do that today? Well, they just send spreadsheets all in different structures and different formats, and then of course they would send somebody into the bank, which is working with the HR department to go and get things signed off and whatnot, right?
Yep.
With the pandemic, now we basically talked to these institutions and took their thoughts directly to the bank, and we said, like, why don't we just digitize this process entirely via we can, Wizard of Oz at first, right? But then later on, let's set up an API and do it, right? And of course, banks just went, yes, that this needs to happen. And to sort of touch on that geographic component, like, it requires payroll organization to be in order to set up a bank account, they have to go to a branch outlet which is closest to that institution, the headquarters of that institution, right? And so how do they do that? Well, they can't. It's a little bit hard again. And, so one of the educational institutions that we're dealing with is based in Yogyakarta, right? Mm-hmm. And so we have to set up a rail to make sure that we're communicating with the branch as well as the bank, right, in relation to the institution, so that we can digitize this account opening, right? It's very exciting, actually, because this is actually again, as Todd said before, the very first steps to proper open banking, to the digitization of these the financial infrastructure of, well, Indonesia here and soon to be the Philippines. So yeah.
So if I understand you correctly, though, it sounds like the existing distribution network, the branch managers in the local area with the firms that are digitizing are actually also part of the journey. Is that right?
They are part of the journey.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So for this, and so it's pretty crazy, right? So it would go from an institution through to the bank. The bank end then has to contact the branch. The branch then has to contact the institution. Institution goes to the branch. Basically, to set up a payroll account can take 3 to 4 weeks, right, on a good month, right? And what we're like seeing is that we can get turnaround times down to 24 hours, right? And the dream is to make it instant, right? So that's what we would love to get to.
That's awesome. What I love about that is it sounds like there's also an education part of that, right? So it's what's interesting about open banking is it's very easy for all of us who sort of work with that every day to get very excited about different types of APIs and how good they are and all of the technology behind that, get fired up when you're dealing with a batch service on the back end of an API stack that doesn't quite connect properly. But from a customer perspective and actually understanding the value of open banking, that education process seems like it's a really important part of the journey. Have you found that spending time with your customers and out in the communities or connecting with people, whether it be over video, over phone, over whatever's available during a lockdown, has that been a big part of what you're doing as well? Because it sounds like it is.
Todd,
either of you could take that.
I'll give. So we have two main. We think of our customers in two big chunks, right? Chunk number one are the FIs themselves, right?
Yep.
The financial institution. Now, some of the digital banks are actually consumers of APIs, right? So they're consuming a direct debit payment API or an account aggregation API from other places, but by and large, it's usually a conversation about publishing new API products, right? That is a tremendously difficult conversation. Just because API as product almost never in terms of, as we've seen it, never is owned by a single business unit or group. There is one bank that comes to mind that does have an API business unit, but even they have to go cap in hand to corporate banking, transaction banking, because at the end of the day, corporate or transaction banking will still own the relationship of the client that is served by the API. So it's the internal governance is super messy. I think so customer education side, I don't mean to sound patronizing at all, and I am not a banking IT expert, nor am I like a lifer, and nor probably do I appreciate all the difficult compliance and security requirements of being a CIO at a bank, for example. So with that big fat disclaimer caveat aside, I think there are a ton of misconceptions about what a proper modern API integration layer and API products look like on a bank, right?
Yep.
And I think the reason for that is because a lot of these IT heads have been, the whispering in their ears coming from the legacy enterprise IT providers that are selling fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and selling $20 million core banking transformations. Oh, and by the way, we'll give you APIs, right? So there's a ton of misconceptions about what is an API gateway and an API management system. What do secure APIs look like? And then there's a commercial question, which is more for the head of transaction banking, head of retail, or even head of corporate banking for some use cases, which is, what does an API product look like in terms of commercial revenue, commercial value for me, the banker, right? And that is actually a much easier conversation since March, right? Because the branch is a channel that basically disappeared.
Yeah.
So they have to think about new ways, and the willingness to partner is much greater. But we could have a whole other session about myths and misconceptions about what the open banking stack means for a bank, right? And I think I'll pause there, but I think it's a lot of kind of misconceptions are outdated. The way I compare it, just to conclude on this point, is I compare it to the early adoption of cloud services, like whatever 10 years ago, right? Where we're on cloud, we're not on cloud. Is cloud secure? Should we move to cloud? All these sort of big questions that are way too broad for the specific questions that a bank needs to be asking, right? Because it's not one word, in this case, one acronym API or Open API is way too broad to cover concerns, and it's a very loaded word, right? And so now I think every CEO understands what cloud services are and will make a business decision about how and where they use cloud services. And I think we're at the very, very beginning of that conversation when it comes to API products.
Yep.
So anyway, that's a long answer to the kind of customer education on the bank side. And Mike, customer education on the kind of fintech and user side?
Yeah, I think specifically from the user side, right? Because fintechs want to get into this because they see a world of opportunity, right? To be able to, for me to create a third-party application or an e-wallet or something like that, and I can then also have people inside that application to create a bank account directly in that e-wallet. I mean, for them, it's a no-brainer, right?
Yep.
And again, going back to a point earlier on was, if they could, they would, but they can't, right? So there's a bit of that going on. So I'm going to talk a little bit from the consumer side, right? So Indonesia, the Bank of Indonesia, they released, basically the roadmap for open banking through to 2025. The first step of that was really to provide a funds transfer rail through a QR network, very similar to Thailand, PromptPay, right, and PayNow, in Singapore, right? And so that was launched on the 1st of January. Now, you go and speak to the average warung owner on the side of the street in what are we now? Close to the end of the year, and you ask them, what do you pay via QRAS? They'll look at you like you are an alien, right? And the reality is that there is a whole education component about an entire funds transfer rail which is available to Indonesians across 17,000. Right, it's not being done, and there's multiple reasons which I'm not going to touch on today because I might stir some nests. But the reality is that your average Indonesian is able to pay from their OVO account into their BCA mobile account or from Lingkaja to Dana, right? Yep. And they can do this, right? And so what are we doing at Brankas? So we're going to go screw it. Let's build it into the product that we have. And we educate our customers directly that way. We say, what channels can they pay from A to B? We, even though there's no difference, it's still the same network. But we'll say, if you have an OVO account, you can pay to Lingkaja. If you have a Lingkaja account, you can pay to Dana, right? And educate through action, through behavior change. Because honestly, that's other than marketing, that's the only way we can change it. And so that's sort of what we're doing today with our products.
No, that's awesome. I mean, honestly, the aim of this session is obviously to stir nests, so don't worry about that too much. I guess I wanted to just address our audience briefly, guys. If you've got questions, please feel free to throw them into the chat. This is an interactive session. Both Todd and Mike have said to me that there's nothing that they're not afraid to discuss, so please hook in. In the meantime, what I'll do is I'll jump into, I guess, more of a personal tack. Mike, what are you looking forward to about 2021? Both from a personal front and then also from a business front. What are you excited about?
From a personal front, I mean, it's really to I mean, I grew up in Indonesia, so and seeing just the ability to access financial components for friends, family, and the rails for those to be made available would be incredible, right? I've got family which are based in very remote parts of Indonesia, and even just getting access to a small business loan or something like that in order to grow their little shop, right? It's a nightmare. It's a nightmare, right? And basically for a lot of them, it's almost impossible, right? And so in 2021, with the rails which are being built out today, just find, not just because of Brankas or other organizations, just generally speaking, I'm looking to 2021 personally as quite a positive thing, and to see actual direct implications and impact on people that I know, which I think will be quite incredible. Which is aligned to my sort of, why I originally joined Brankas in the first place is I want to help build the infrastructure for this to happen. And to, next year we're going to start seeing open banking pilots go live. We're going to start seeing regulations being implemented. Mistakes definitely going to be made, right? But we're going to see a lot more action on the open banking front in this part of the world. And we're a part of it, and I love to be a part of it. So that's it in a nutshell.
That's super cool. And Todd, for you, the same question, right? What are you looking forward to personally and professionally next year?
Yeah. So personally, I am. I'm very closely tied to as a founder, right? Very closely tied to the company. So professional and personal, Brankas is very close on both sides. I am. So I'm number one. I'm looking forward personally to as a consumer and corporate banking customer in the Philippines. I am looking forward to a less bad experience, which means that we are seeing, and we know this because we know we're working with several banks that are launching big, completely new, starting from scratch digital initiatives in the Philippines next quarter, and I think it's going to be really exciting, and I think there is going to be a tremendous wake-up call for some of the larger incumbents that have been very happy with very comfortable margins and sizable market power. And it's going to be a wake-up moment. I think this wake-up moment in Indonesia happened maybe last year, also partly this year, or maybe it's still kind of the wake-up moment is still happening. In Philippines, I don't think it's happened yet, right? I don't think this oh crap, need to kind of fundamentally rethink our the banking model and the banking business model, again, particularly consumer SME. Corporate, you can sort of milk that cash cow for a little bit longer. It's relationship based, it's kind of hunting whales, and it's a different business, right? So I think that's
the
really
term in the
exciting
Philippines
to
is
me.
whale sharks, right? Hunting whale sharks.
Whale sharks, that's right. I think so. I'm looking forward to that. I'm also looking forward to improving how we work remotely, because I think the model is awesome. I think it has tremendous advantages for an organization, but it's hard, right? It's hard. It's hard. It's hard in terms of you have to do better screening for candidates. You have to make twice as much effort to build an organizational culture. You have to make sure that there are random water cooler type conversations. And then also externally, because this is the first time that, especially working with banks, they're accustomed to face-to-face meetings. You come to their office and wait in the lobby. And so there's a new way of working with our partners and our clients as well. So, but I love it. I personally, as much as I, like people, enjoy my colleagues and appreciate having a physical office, the remote and working, going all in and no looking back on remote working, both internally and with our clients, is something that I'm really excited about. Because if we're remote but our clients expect physical, then you still sometimes have to default to physical, right? But if it's a remote world, I think that really unlocks some really cool stuff. So there. Other things I'm looking forward to, I'm of course looking forward to a vaccinated world, but that's unfortunately, I think in Southeast Asia, that's going to come a bit later. Although it's exciting that the UK had their first vaccination yesterday. I think that's what I'm looking forward to.
No, that's awesome, and actually, there's a few points in there that I want to pick up on. First of all, if anybody, there's some great interviews out on the BBC and various other news stations with some of the older folks in the UK who've had their vaccination. So quality viewing if anybody hasn't seen that yet. But more importantly, we've been speaking to a few founders over the course of these Ask Me Anythings, and one of the things that's been, put forward as a challenge with remote work is not being able to walk the floor. and not being able to have that human interaction, meet new people in the organisation as an organisation grows. How are you guys working through that at the moment and staying connected and having incidental conversations? And you mentioned water cooler. How are you facilitating some of that stuff at the moment? Mike, you can kick off.
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
I think this is Todd's initiative more than mine. But
right.
So things that we're
as a B2B enterprise company, I mean, events like Singapore Fintech Fest were, last year this was our biggest event of the year, right? Had a big booth, participating in panels, participating in discussions, organizing a bunch of sidebar events, right? And it's a coming together. And what this means, it's a good question, because we've had to put a lot of thought into what this means. And basically it's how do you build a brand and build customer education about what open banking is in a market that is not familiar with open banking. What it means, I really don't want to use the term thought leadership, so I won't, but it's basically building Brankas as a source of expertise on open banking. So that as a way of generating inbound interest. I mean, that's really what it looks like, right? What does that mean? That means participating in virtual conferences. That means hosting webinars, right? So we host practically one webinar a week, which is everything from interviewing another fintech CEO, interviewing a banker, having a panel discussion. We've hosted, I think, 4 masterclasses now, and Mike's led one of them, where we have Brankas senior leaders going into a deep dive for 2 hours, a technical deep dive in their function, right? Which I think have been really well received. And does this lead directly to new business for us, or does this allow us interaction with clients? Not necessarily, but it creates awareness of what open finance and open banking is, and it allows us to provide an open door for anyone that wants to come and ask more, right? I think that's part of it, and then the benefit, I think, that is not always realized is when everyone's remote, people are a lot more accessible. So it's actually easier to get meetings with folks because they're at home, right? You don't have to, they're not, in Manila or Jakarta, typically this means, you're sitting in traffic for 2 hours each way. And then you're in the office, and the office is stacked with in-person meetings, and you're pulled into God knows how many committees, right? And so those sort of time-wasting activities are minimized, if not going away entirely. So that's our approach on the kind of the business development and walking the halls with clients. How we think about that.
I mean, those insights are really powerful. So jump in, Mike. Yeah, please go ahead. I was interested in your thoughts.
No, just going to. So, like internal, with the water cooler conversation internally, like what do we do at Brankas, right? So, so we have every 2 weeks, I think it is, Todd, right? We have a quarantine sharing session, right? Get people engaged, right? And people have a drink and just relax, right? There's also the I think we do like a weekly coffee catch up, which the other day they were playing Among Us, right?
That's awesome.
And then we also had our one-on-ones, which are our weekly with direct team members, which I'll be honest, there's because people are not engaging with others as much at the moment. So there's definitely a bit of the company management or tactical stuff, but there's also a bit of the psychological management as well, right? And so there's definitely a whole with these sort of 3 things that are in place, and we do sporadic things as well, but I tend to find that people are quite open with sharing thoughts and just having a chat, that water cooler conversation that you're referring to.
No, I think we're all learning around this, right? So that how to replace a 3D multi-central interaction with a human with a 2D interaction. There's a lot of work that needs to go in that, and the way that we treat people respectfully and engage. So those insights, I think, are really powerful, and I think there's a lot of work for psychologists over the next couple of years to work out how that's affecting us all and the tools that we need to get through it. So, but I think I agree. I think we're moving in the right direction.
Go check out gather.town. It's a pretty cool product.
Okay. I guess one last thing I want to really pick up on is the agricultural, the lending to agriculture was a really interesting, or servicing agriculture was a really interesting point that you made. And this came up in our conversation yesterday morning with Bridie from Jura, where it seems that in the supply chain, whether it's access to capital, whether it's payment for goods and services, that sector is particularly neglected. They're the source of the food in a large amount of time that feeds us as a planet, yet they tend to get the least support financially from direct earnings, from access to information and tools, and then from access to finance. How do you guys think about that?
Yeah, so I wanted to actually bring this up earlier as one of my, aspirations or hope, kind of what I'm looking forward to in 2021 is that we see some of the first brand new companies that are launched because they're able to build on infrastructure that Brankas has enabled, right?
Yeah.
And I think this needs to be the mindset. So you're right. I mean, there's a massive underserved population. I mean, in the Philippines, there's a common phrase, the 5-6 lenders, right? These are the informal lenders in the neighborhood, and it's called 5-6 because you give me 5, I pay you back 6.
Yeah.
What does that mean? It means it's a 20% monthly interest rate, right? That is informal lending. And then, then there are major issues that happen if that money is not paid back, right? I mean, that's a reality with most informal lending around emerging markets, similar in Indonesia. Banks, I think are pretty awful at serving SMEs. It's a multi-week time. You have to have a kind of a personal connection at the bank in order to get your documents through. Regardless, you're making multiple trips to the branch, et cetera. There are alternative lenders that are popping up. Frankly speaking, because the risk is high and because they have to work with banks one way or another, the interest rates are still, sky high, right? So what I'm looking for is the first set of banks and maybe some of these online lenders that are working with banks to build specific credit products for underserved populations, like farmer cooperatives, like supply chain finance at the more lower value end, right? And we're working with some of them that are going to be launching in next year. But I think again, just to reiterate, the banks need to let go of the mindset that they need to build everything in house, right? Because by providing a platform where they're providing the deposit, they're providing the transaction ledger, they're providing the loan management system, they're providing some of the capital, right? And then they can work with a fintech partner to extend the reach of the banking infrastructure to segments that the bank on its own would opt out of serving, or would take years, or would just be a pet project that doesn't get the resources it deserves.
Yep.
So I think letting new fintechs build on top of API infrastructure and solve these problems, that is what's really, really exciting. And I think we'll see more and more of that in Southeast Asia in this coming year, actually.
Yeah, that's awesome. Mike, does that tie into, like, so, you mentioned some of the folks that you want to help, or see benefit. Does that tie into some of the same problems that you're looking to solve?
Yeah, 100%. And it really comes down to remove the blocker to gain access to capital on request access to capital, right? And there are lots of blockers in between today, whether they're manual process, whether they're political, whether they're whatever there are. And number 2 is to remove as much as possible the amount of middle management of funds transfers and whatnot, right?
Yeah.
Because the reality is that the more steps that it goes through to get to the destination, the more clips that are taken, right?
Yep.
And the more clips that are taken, it's the person on the other side who gets hit by that, right? And why is it 20%? Why is it 50% in some cases with lending, right?
Yep.
In the likes of the Philippines and Indonesia and other countries as well. Well, it's those steps, right? It's those steps. And if you take those away, and it's really just a direct connection between where the money needs to come from and go to, then it'll become more accessible. That's what I think. No,
thanks very much, Mike. And look, we've come to the end of our time, and I just wanted to summarize some of those key points. If we look back at that, I think in that last point that we talked about, if we can imagine, the farmers that are remote, that don't have access to all of the information, modern farming techniques, the kind of sustainable farming practices that we'd like to drive, we're holding those people accountable for a lot of the climate change response, right? Yet we're depriving them of much needed capital and support. So when we look at a supply chain, when we look at the products that we're building, if we can think of those people that feed all of us, and we can come right back to all of the efficiencies we need to deliver to make sure they're getting the access that will create the type of profit or sustainability of that ecosystem, I think that's a really powerful way for us to think forward. I think you've mentioned some really great points about remote working and the benefits of that, access to different kinds of talent, diverse talent across different spaces, and most importantly, from an open banking perspective, I think really that insight around it's not this blanket statement about just one, we'll just stick an API sticker on it and we're done. It's really getting into the weeds of that end-to-end connectivity to build the platform that allows companies to grow on top of. So Todd Schweitzer, Mike Dickinson, I'd like to thank you both very much for joining us here at Rapyd. It's been such a pleasure to chat to you both.